Today, my guest is a returning guest. Her name's Angela Vorpahl, and we are talking about the three things you need to know before going into your 1L year, and also some things you don't need to know. Yeah, trust me, there are things that you don't necessarily need to know, and this episode is going to teach you all about them. Watch as I even learn something new myself. Hi, Angela. Thank you so much for being my guest again. Welcome back.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for today's conversation.
Listen, so am I. We're wrapping up 1 year. Some people are graduating, but also we got some undergrads going into law school. And I figured now was the perfect time to kind of get a jump on things. And I know that you've got an interesting list or strategies of things people need to know and things they don't necessarily need to know. Tell us what you got about going into the 1L year.
Yeah. So thank you so much for having me. And I think it's really important to talk about this because there are a lot of things that people are told when they're heading into the first year of law school, some of which are very, very important, and some of which you can completely cross off your list as things that don't need to be touched. And so it can be really hard to know what falls into what category if you've never been through the experience or you don't know of anyone who has been through the experience. And so to kind of kick things off with sort of the first category that I like to think about when you are preparing for law school is what I call the law school life plan. And these are sort of the practical pieces of things to have in mind, things to have checked off your list before heading into law school so that you don't have to worry about them. And that list for me includes things like housing, finances, doctor's appointments, personal relationships, and accommodations. And so to kind of flesh that out a little bit, when we're thinking about heading into the first year of law school and how much work it's going to be and how much it's going to demand of your time, if we can get some of these practical life pieces in order or already taken care of, it's going to make that transition that much easier for you so that you can focus on the law school piece and you don't have to focus on some of these real world pieces. And so when we talk about housing, for example, making sure that you have a place to live if you're changing cities, whether that's going to be close to campus, further away from campus, with roommates, without roommates. So making sure that you get really clear on that. When we talk about finances, most law students are going to be financing these next 3 years with some form of student loan. So making sure you know when those distributions are going to happen, having a rough budget for how that money is going to be spent over the course of the semester so that you don't have to worry about paying rent, paying for food. And again, you can focus on the law school pieces. Doctor's appointments is also a fun one. So I know we all get behind on that on dentist appointments and annual checkups, but that's really important because law school is going to take a lot out of you physically and mentally. And so if you can walk into law school feeling strong, being strong, that's going to make a big difference. And kind of a point here too to keep in mind is talking about physical health, but also mental health. I know you guys have probably heard this over and over and over, but law school creates a lot of anxiety, depressive conditions, a lot of difficult things that you're going to be going through for the first time. And so if you're going to be moving to a new city, making sure that you have those mental health care professionals in place so that when inevitably these issues come up, you have somewhere to go and you don't have to feel like you're scrambling to find somebody at the last minute, especially when we talk about really critical periods of time like final exams, for example. And then the last two pieces, I would say personal relationships. Law school, especially 1L year, is so incredibly demanding of your time and of your energy that if you have a significant other in your life, if you live with family, if you have a close friend group, if you have kids, being really communicative about what these next 4 months, if we're talking about the first semester, or 9 months, if we're talking about the whole 1L year, is going to look like for you in terms of being able to carve out these periods of time to spend with people, because it's going to be a lot more limited. And it's important that they know that so they don't feel like they've been abandoned or been sideswiped without knowing how this is going to go. And then you don't have to feel guilty or that you didn't let them know ahead of time that this is how these next 4 to 9 months are going to go. And also that it's not forever, that this is 1L year is by far the toughest of the 3 years of law school, or 4 years if you're an evening student. And so having those conversations ahead of time. And then the last one, I would also make sure that you guys are aware of our accommodations. So a lot of law students heading in have either never had accommodations before, or maybe just beginning to recognize that they might have a situation or condition that allows for accommodation. So starting that conversation early, literally sending an email or making a call to your student services department, asking what the process is to go about requesting accommodations, because every law school is different. That can take a long time. That can require a lot of steps. And again, if we can have those conversations before you start law school, that's not something you're going to have to deal with once classes begin.
Right. You hit on something that I promise you had my mouth wide open. Nobody ever thinks about the fact that you're going to need doctor's appointments. Myself, I sent my daughter off to college and literally was on some wow. Probably should have had her go to the dentist before she left the state, and I have to switch a whole bunch of things around. Uh, I did make sure that she saw the primary care physician, but I know for a fact we skipped the dentist and probably the eye doctor. Those are things that people don't normally think about when they're doing these kinds of transitions. And if you're going to a whole different state, are you going to make sure you've got everything with your professionals at home, or are you going to go and get recommendations and find other professionals when you're there? If you have allergies, is there a pharmacy that's going to be close by where you can get any type of prescriptions filled? Those are things that I did not think about until she got to Florida, and I was like, oh wait, what's the nearest pharmacy to you? These are things that I think that you've brought up that are absolutely gold, because nobody thinks about, maybe I should check and see if they've got some type of mental health professional close to campus, somebody I can walk to or Uber to. Even if you don't need it now, you never know what you're going to need help with later. It's good to check those things out in the area before you go.
Yeah, absolutely. And for some of the things we might be aware of ahead of time, like you mentioned, a dentist appointment, a general care physician, and some things come up in the midst of law school just because of how pressurized an environment it is and how new and difficult these things are. And so if we can even just start those conversations or start those searches to have a bit of an on-ramp, so you don't feel like you are sort of a fish out of water if something happens and there's absolutely no time and no energy to be able to look into those things.
So we've talked about things that you need to know. Anything else that you have up your sleeve that somebody might really, really need to know before going into that 1L?
Yeah, absolutely. So, after sort of these practical life considerations, which are, of course, important as we talked about, the next thing that I think of when preparing students for 1L year are the study strategies. And this is all about sort of the academic piece of law school, because a lot of us have heard that 1L year is hard, but we don't really know what that means. And we've heard that 1L year is not like college, but we don't know what that means either. And so, what we really want to have in place before we start is, what are we actually going to do tangibly, practically, action step speaking, to position ourselves for the grades that we want? Because the reality is that in law school, the first year grades are going to be the most powerful for a number of reasons. Part of it is because of the way that law school hiring works, puts a huge emphasis on 1L year grades, but also you have other things like extracurriculars like law review and moot court. You also have teaching assistant positions and research assistant positions with professors. And so, of course, grades are not the end all be all, but they are a very powerful tool to be able to open up opportunities for yourself down the road. And so, what we don't want to have happen is we walk into class on the very first day and we start to try to figure these pieces out or try to reverse engineer them, because simultaneously we're getting buried by the workload. And so ideally, we would learn these strategies, know what they look like, know why we're doing them, know when they're happening, actually take the steps to practice them, familiarize ourselves with them, so that when the first day of class starts, we are actually starting to implement them. We're not starting to try to figure them out from zero. When I think about 1L grade strategy, I think of it sort of in three chunks. And the first chunk is a time strategy. So getting really, really clear on how we're spending our time on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, so that every hour that we are investing and that we're putting into this is directly tied to the result that we want to get. Because what can often happen is that we just start working because we don't know what else to do. And there's not a through line for why in the world we're doing the things that we're doing. And it can be sort of the middle of the semester, end of the semester, before we ever sort of stop and think about that 30,000 foot picture of how does all of this fit together. The second piece of that, I would say, is the study strategy. So we are being taught an avalanche of new material. And so how are we actually learning this stuff, internalizing this stuff when it's coming at us as quickly as it is? And of course, these concepts are incredibly complex. So what are we doing to actually teach our brains this information in a way that we can understand? And then the third piece, that in the way that I sort of picture it, is the final exam strategy. And so a lot of us think that if we just know the law, that's enough to compete for one of the top grades in our classes. And the reality is that law school, you guys may have heard this before, should be really called exam writing school, because that is where all of our points come from. That's where our grade comes from, are these final exams, sometimes midterms, but these final exam analyses that we have to write. And so that connective thread between all the time that we're spending learning this stuff, and then how do we get it in words on a page that actually gets us points, is an incredibly important strategy that ideally we will know before heading into our first class.
All of this talk about studying gave me an idea. And I think the idea is tied into a theory or a boot camp that you have about beating the curve. Tell me how all of that can help with all of this.
Yeah, so I run a 6-week 1L prep program called Beat the Curve Bootcamp. And it's actually something that I'm partnering with Barrier Breakers this year. So I'm really excited about that. I imagine there's more information or a link for you to learn more if you're curious in the show notes. But it's all about breaking down these strategies step by step, understanding what they are, why we're doing them, and then also being able to see them built out in real time. And then for you to also have the opportunity to put those steps into action so that you know what they are. And more importantly, you can show yourself that you can do them. I think that one of the things that's so hard about law school is that it feels like this very nebulous sort of experience that we know is hard and we know it's a lot and we know it's going to be tough, but we don't really know, practically speaking, what that means. And so I think because of that, there's a lot of uncertainty and fear that's sort of generated about the law school experience. And so the idea behind Beat the Curve Bootcamp is to break down those strategies in a really tangible way, and also sort of rip off the Band-Aid of sort of that fear and uncertainty of, do I have what it takes? Am I smart enough to be here? Can I really do this thing? To show yourself, yeah, absolutely. This is what the game is. This is how I do it. And I'm totally capable of doing this and being here.
So it's not even beating the curve, it's getting way ahead of the curve, is what you're teaching them. Like, in my mind, I just took all of that to mean, if I know that I'm going to be kind of frustrated in the 1L, take this class so I can get ahead of the frustration and learn how to study through it and not even end up there. I think that this is probably one of the most valuable tools that anyone could have going into their 1L year. Learn what's going to happen so that way it doesn't all fall on you. Like you said, the avalanche, it doesn't all come pouring down on you if you know where it is and you know how to study for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think when you think about law school kind of at a high level, the kinds of people that are attracted to law school is generally a group of smart, hardworking, ambitious overachievers, right? Most people who decide to go on to law school did really well in undergrad, did really well in grad school, have every intention of continuing to be very successful and go after these really big dreams and goals. And so what can happen when we self-select into a group like that is that for the first time, we're surrounded by other people who are very similar to ourselves in those respects. And in terms of talking about the the way that the law school system is graded is on a bell curve, meaning that most grades are going to fall somewhere in the middle, somewhere in the B range. And then there's a very small percentage of grades that fall on either side of that, meaning the A's and A minuses in a given class are going to be very limited. And so, again, practically speaking, the way that plays out is that we are competing against every other person in our class for the 5 A's that might be offered or the 10 A minuses that might be available. And so that can create, of course, a lot of pressure, a lot of competitiveness, and this feeling of overwhelm of I'm down to do the work. I'm down to work hard. This matters to me. I want to put everything I have into this, but then not knowing where to channel that energy or not knowing where to channel that time in a way that is most effective and most efficient to getting that end goal, which is the result that you want on final exams.
Hmm. When you put it like that, if there's only 5 A's, 10 A minuses, and chances are we are getting a B, it does take the pressure off. You do your best and you kind of know where you're going to aim and land, but you give it your best shot no matter what.
Yeah, and I think my perspective around the grade piece is it's sort of interesting, and this might lead into this next piece too that we'll talk about, which is grades at the end of the day are really just a marketing tool. They are one marketing tool that we can use to go after the job opportunities that we want. Nobody is going after grades in law school simply for grades in law school. We're doing it because it opens up these internships, these summer associateships, and ultimately our first job out of law school. It helps us to open those doors, right? And so when we're thinking about grades, I think there's a really important conversation that is always happening around divesting your self-worth from the number itself, because at the end of the day, again, the grade is a tool. It is not a reflection of self-worth. It's just a tool that we're going to use. And then the beauty of being able to make that separation too is that you can look at it as a tool. Meaning if you are already planning to do 1L year, that likely means you are already planning to put in the hours. You already understand it's nights and weekends. You already understand the workload and the stress that it requires. And so if we're going to go into a situation like that, and we already know we're going to put ourselves through that process, why wouldn't we make sure that every hour that we're spending is as effective as it can be? Because if we're going to go through the process, it doesn't make sense to try to kind of, for lack of a better term, like half-ass it or show up partially, because you're going to be going through the stress of it anyway. So go ahead, put yourself in the most powerful position you can. Whatever happens, the outcome itself, we don't have total control over, but what we do have control over are the actions that we take and the process that we put in place, so that when we're doing things and when we're spending this time, we're doing it with intention and we're doing it with purpose and we're doing it strategically with a plan.
Yeah, you said it, and it made me think you can't just phone in your 1L year. There is no, just calling it in, just phone it. You have to be committed to it in order to conquer it. And I think that beating the curve, boot camp is definitely one of the best things you can do. If it's there for you, make sure you do it so that you don't end up, in a bad position. If you're going to go to law school and you're going into your 1L, you might as well set yourself up for success ahead of time. Hmm.
Yeah,
So you
absolutely.
mentioned something else, and I think that there's other categories too. What you need to know. What's the other portion?
Yeah. So interestingly, so we were talking about the grade piece because 1L year in general, the first semester specifically, that's the only thing that you're focusing on. Ideally, in a perfect world, if you have the luxury to be able to focus your time and attention on your classes, that's where we want to be focusing that, because of how much work it is, how steep the learning curves are, how much discipline it requires. But again, at the end of the day, grades are a tool that we're using for a different end goal. They're a means, not an end, right? And the end is to be able to build the career and the life that you want. And so in order to open up those job opportunities, if we can keep that sort of at the back of our mind or even at the forefront of our mind, then there are things that we can do before law school even starts to start to open those doorways for ourselves. And so this third piece after the law school life plan, after the study strategies, I would say is career development. And I know that for myself, it's so much easier said than done, because no way was this on my radar when I was heading into law school. But having now been exactly a law school strategy coach, it is in my, it would be disingenuous of me not to at least introduce these concepts for those of you guys who have the time, who have the space, who have the energy to be able to start implementing some of this stuff. And so before law school even starts, one of the things that most of us don't even think about are more close in time is going to be our 1L summer job. So our 1L summer job, which happens after our 1L year, so starting in May, June, and July, after that first year of law school, those internships and summer job opportunities can come online as early as October, November, December of your first semester. And I think, and I know I didn't realize that, and for most of us, we're not aware of that. And so what that means is right around the time when we're starting to prepare for final exams, some of these things can start to come online. And so what we can do to front load that work is to actually have our 1L resume, our 1L cover letter, and our 1L diversity statement in place, so that if something comes online and we decide we would like to apply for it, we are, the only thing that we're tweaking is about 1% of the work. We're not trying to create these documents from zero. And I think the reason that a lot of us don't think about this, one is that we're just not aware of when these opportunities become available. But the other piece too is, I know that I thought, and I know a lot of students think this way, which is, oh, we're going to have so much to add to these documents because we'll have gone through an entire semester of law school. And the reality is that 99% of the information that's going to make up your resume, your cover letter, and your diversity statement has already happened to you. It has already happened before law school starts. The only things that you might add after that first semester of law school is maybe a bullet point about a scholarship that you were awarded later in the cycle, or maybe a bullet point about a student organization that you joined in name only. I don't even recommend getting incredibly involved in a student organization your first semester because of how important learning all these different pieces of your classes are. And so those 2 bullet points can be added in about 30 seconds. The rest of the work can be done ahead of time. And then again, when these opportunities come available, whether it's October, November, December, January, the only piece that you have to personalize is for the specific legal organization, is for the specific law firm that you're applying to. And again, now you have reduced immensely the amount of work for your future self if you can do these steps ahead of time.
Where were you when I needed to know this kind of information about doing it ahead of time? Because honestly, what's really going to change? Like you said, maybe a scholarship or two, maybe an organization or two. And honestly, that's under 5 minutes of work. If you've got the spare time in the summer before you go into the 1L or whenever you go into your 1L, do it now. Do it now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's kind of also, I mean, we'll talk about a few other pieces here, but that's kind of an important mindset to have going into law school in general, is the more we front load the work, the easier we're going to make life for ourselves down the road. And that has to do with everything. That has to do with the reading, that has to do with outlining, that has to do with final exam prep. If you can do it early, then you open up this beautiful time and space for yourself to have more opportunities to do more things later, and or have a more spacious and less stressful period at the end, whether that's final exams if we're talking grades, or an interview process if we're talking jobs. And so the other part of this career development piece that is one of these things that all of us know we should do, but very few of us actually do. The next one I would say is your LinkedIn profile. So it's no secret that all the social media platform that all lawyers are on is LinkedIn. That's where everybody hangs out. That's where connections are made. That's where you can comment on people's posts. That's where you can reach out, which we'll talk about in a second. And so having a profile up there that you feel comfortable with, that if somebody were to click on your profile, that you don't feel embarrassed, or you don't feel like it's juvenile, or that it isn't just well thought through. And so having that in place is a real confidence booster to be able to then interact with lawyers online. The other piece of that, and more importantly, which is again, not something I did, but something I would have told my 1L self heading in, is the power of informational interviews. And there's a really great video that I made with Dave Strausberg about this, because I didn't know anything about informational interviews, but it's essentially just reaching out to people who are doing the thing you want to do in the city where you want to do it. And so I know that for a lot of us heading into law school, we have no idea what kind of law we want to practice. Everybody talks about how important it is to know. Nobody actually knows. And the people this is like such a generalization, but the people who think that they know 99.9% of the time, they're going to change because we just don't have that much exposure to the different practice areas yet. And so there's no way that we can have enough information to make that call or that decision ahead of time. That being said, that doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do. If we have, I will call it the confidence, but just the grit to start to reach out to lawyers in the cities that we want to work in, doing the type of work we think we might want to do, and even better, alumni of the law school that we're going to go to, because they always tend to have a better return rate of interest in helping you out because of that connection point. We can then start to craft a genuine response and narrative about what we think we might want to do. And this sounds like it's a small thing, but these questions are going to come up repeatedly in networking events and in interviews about what type of law do you want to practice? What type of law do you want to practice? Why do you want to practice that type of law? And sure, if we had experience in a type of law, which is such a small percentage of us, great. We can talk genuinely and authentically about that being the area that we want to practice in. But for most of us, we don't have legal experience. It's not required at all, by the way, but we don't have it. Or even if we do have it, we're interviewing for a position that is completely unrelated to the thing that we interned in or worked in. And so a really great data point to be able to answer that question genuinely in an interview is that you've had conversations with lawyers who work in this area and they said XYZ about the type of work, about the type of clients, about the projects they worked on. And that shows such a maturity and an understanding of the business and the work that is going to make you really shine and really stand out from the other candidates, myself included at the time, who haven't had these conversations.
You have given me so many things to think about. This is why I love talking to you, because even if it's not necessarily law school that somebody's applying to, they can still take a lot of pieces of what we've said and front load themselves or get themselves in a better position for employment, for internships later on, no matter what field of study they're in.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too, the reason that we don't do this, one, I'm not going to lie, it's scary. It's scary to reach out cold to someone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other piece too is that we don't feel, this is me completely projecting, by the way, but this would have been my 1L self of, we don't feel like we have anything to offer. Who am I to reach out to a lawyer? Who am I to have this conversation? I don't know anything about the law. I don't have any experience to offer. But what we don't realize is actually what a perfect position we're in to have these conversations, because one, we're not asking for anything right now. We're not asking for an internship. We're not asking for a job. There's no ulterior motive behind these conversations other than genuine interest and curiosity and getting to know the person and getting to know how they wound up in this type of law and getting to know what projects they work on a weekly basis. And then the other piece too is that lawyers love giving advice, period, and love giving advice about law school. And so as an incoming 1L asking the question, what was your 1L year like? What, if any, advice do you have for me? Is just giving them this beautiful soapbox to stand on that all of us just love to talk about. And so you're actually in a really perfect position to have these conversations, even though it might not feel like it.
And we all get a little bit anxious about things and don't want to do it. Like you said, who am I to ask these things? So because you said we could ask, what do I need to expect or what do I need to know? What are some things that we don't necessarily need to know going into the 1L?
Yeah, really good question. So I think there are a few things that I, at least being in the industry, hear a lot of people saying as pieces of advice that I think are misguided. And so one of those things that you might hear a lot is that you just need to read a lot. You need to read a lot before law school. You need to get used to reading. And it doesn't even matter what, like read the US Constitution, read a bajillion US Supreme Court cases, read long Russian novels. Like it doesn't matter. Just get used to reading. And the reason I think this advice continues to be perpetuated is this idea that, of course, there is a lot of reading in law school. You're going to be assigned a lot of pages of cases to read. And so I guess the thought is if you get used to speed reading or just the mental capacity and endurance to be able to read for a long period of time, that's going to help. The problem with this advice is that when we're talking about reading in law school, it's not actually about the speed at which you can read a case or even honestly the quantity of pages that you can get through. What we're talking about is being able to categorize information that is coming out of a case. And so when we're talking about creating case briefs, for example, which is kind of the bread and butter of preparing for class, we're talking about identifying very specific parts of the case, the issue, the facts, the rule, the analysis, and the holding, and being able to almost sort of paint by numbers, kind of how I think of it, categorize this information into pieces so that we can, at the bottom of all of this, follow the class lecture. Because at the end of the day, your professor is going to be addressing and going to be introducing these topics in a particular format. And so that's what we're setting ourselves up to understand when we walk into class. That is not speed reading, and it's not even quantity of reading. And so I feel very strongly that that's not something that anybody needs to spend their time doing before law school, which is just sort of like blind reading of incredibly long passages.
Right. It's also about the comprehension. Can you understand what was being said and those things as well?
Yes. And what's interesting about that is that I think heading into law school, our understanding or our belief is that we need to be able to read a case cold, like crack open a case book and read it cold and understand it. And the problem with that, or what that actually leads to, is us investing hours and hours and hours and hours of time reading these cases and then feeling like complete morons because we didn't get the one question that our professor asked us in class. And so what I highly, highly, highly recommend is that before you ever crack open a case book, that you actually first consult a resource that is specifically designed to teach you what that case is, what that case stands for, what the big takeaway of the case is. So one of the most popular resources to be able to do that right now is Quimby. Quimby has these case brief videos that breaks it down, talking to you like you're an eighth grader about what is the background of this case, what were the parties litigating, and why is it relevant. And the reason that that is so important is because when judges write their opinions, which is what cases are, written judicial opinions, resolving a dispute in a lawsuit, is that they're not writing them with law students in mind. And so when a judge is writing an opinion, they're not being clear about the issue I am deciding in this case is X. The rule that I am creating from nothing is Y. The outcome or the holding of this case is Z. And so in order to better connect those dots and honestly to do it faster because of the amount of material that we have, having that case resource ahead of time is really, really key so that when you sit down to read the case, now you know what you're looking for, you know what these big pieces are that are going to come up, and you can follow it that much more easily.
Love it. Love it. So, what else do we not necessarily need to know going into the 1L?
Yeah. So the other thing I would say that you hear a lot is, and it's very counterintuitive, is legal knowledge. And so this you might hear people talk about like, oh, I'm going to go read 17 supplements before law school starts so I can teach myself criminal law, torts, contracts, property, whatever it is. And even though that sounds like it would be a good strategy in theory, the problem with doing that is that when we're talking about learning concepts of law, they are not sort of these high level 30,000 foot view concepts that we can just read and immediately understand. We're talking about hundreds of data points that are conflicting at times, that are multi-layered, that have exceptions to them, which is why we pay a professional, i.e. a professor, to actually teach us these things in class over the course of 4 months. And even then it's hard to understand. And so to try to teach yourself the law before law school is going to generate a lot more frustration and overwhelm than it is actually going to help you ever understand these concepts. The other reason why I'm not a fan of having that be one of your priorities or one of your strategies heading into law school is because even though, yes, there is a lot of overlap in the content of what you're going to be learning, regardless of what law school you go to, it is also true that every professor has a very specific structure for how they're going to teach this content. And the reason that they can do that is because our common law system is actually a patchwork of information. It's a patchwork of laws. We have laws that are coming from cases. We have laws that are coming from state and federal statutes. We have laws that are coming from restatements. And so because we have these different laws coming from different places and we have different language associated with those places, it can be very frustrating if, for example, you spent the last 4 months trying to teach yourself contracts, and then you walk in and your professor is teaching it in a way that feels contradictory to that or different than that. And so not only understanding the legal concepts, but understanding them in the way that your professor wants you to understand them for the final exam is really, really key. And so what I would say in terms of legal understanding, the what I tell my students is the deepest I would go is a very, very, very high level introductory video about giving you the opportunity to just hear the terms. And so Quimby does a really good job of this. Studicata does a really good job of this, where it's not for understanding, it's not for mastery of the material, it's only to have heard terms like personal jurisdiction or battery or inchoate crimes. And again, not even for a full understanding, but if you even want to go there, just so that when you hear those words happening in class, you have heard them once in your life before. So it's really just a familiarity piece. I would not recommend trying to go in and master the material ahead of time.
Yeah, makes no sense to learn something on your own and possibly not learn it in the way that your professor wants you to learn it and the way they're going to test you on it. Counterproductive, to say the least. What's another tip, if you have one, to share about what we don't necessarily need to know?
This sort of career development mentality going in, right, where we are working, not only working as hard as we can, but more specifically being as strategic as we can to set ourselves up for the grades that we want, so that we can set ourselves up for the jobs that we want, so that we can build the career and life that we want, right? That's sort of the means to the end in all of this process. And so one of the things to keep in mind when you head into law school, I've heard a lot of students sort of lament and be worried about not having legal experience heading in. And that makes so much sense, and it's so counterintuitive to say this, but law schools are agnostic about you having legal experience, meaning they don't care whether you have or not. And legal employers are actually agnostic also about you having legal experience, meaning they don't care if you do or not. And it's very bizarre to say it, but you don't need to have an internship. You don't need to have worked as a paralegal. You don't need to have worked in a law firm or a public interest organization or any of those things before law school in order to make yourself a really attractive candidate for legal organizations and for law firms. And in fact, they know that most people don't have those things. And that's not something that they're necessarily going to give you a bump up for if you do have it. And of course, not a bump down for if you don't. That being said, if you find yourself, for example, having finished a job early, or you have graduated from college and you have a few months, absolutely, you can reach out to small law firms in your city or in the city where you're going to go to law school, informational interview style. Ask if they want any free help from somebody who is incredibly ambitious and motivated and is dying to learn and contribute. For sure, you can do that, but you also don't have to. And so I would argue that what is even more valuable and honestly something that could be two birds with one stone is, as you reach out to these lawyers, to get a sense for what does the business of lawyering look like, what does the day-to-day of lawyering work look like, and you're having these conversations. It serves dual purposes. One, it helps you to understand what it is you might want to do, what type of law you might want to practice. It also serves the purpose of helping you understand what the work of a lawyer is, so that you can answer these questions authentically and genuinely and in an informed way in an interview. And then if you were to want to pursue an internship, that's a beautiful next step, to be able to ask them if they're looking for any help. You'd be more than welcome. You'd be more than happy to support them and contribute in that way. But again, that's not something that is a need to have. That's not something that you even have to be worried about or nervous about or anxious about not having heading into law school.
I love the idea of killing two birds with one stone. While I'm already talking to you, doing a little bit of an interview to see what the school is like, what day to day is like. Hey, do you need an intern? You need anybody who can kind of work for free just to kind of get my feet wet in the industry and see what's actually out there? That makes so much more sense than talking to someone in August and then again in June and you haven't really had any contact. It's really good to make all of those connections right there in one piece. What else would you like to share for anyone who's going into the 1L or somebody coming out of grad school who's thinking about going into the 1L?
Yeah, I think that those are the biggest pieces to keep in mind. And I say that because at the end of the day, I know that you guys have a lot of priorities that are going on, right? A lot of people are moving cities. A lot of people are finishing up jobs or finishing up undergrad and grad school. There are a lot of pulls on your time. And so when I'm thinking about the months heading into 1L year, it's important to be really aware of the amount of time that you have to dedicate to this and also really intentional with that time. And so the things that we talked about today are where I would prioritize and focus time to the extent that you have it. And so that when we talk about the law school life plan, when we talk about the study strategies, when we talk about the career development pieces, to the extent that you have the time and space in your schedule to do those things, that's amazing. That's going to set you up, set your future self up for success. That's going to put you in as powerful position as you can be in. But also, I think an important piece to keep in mind is that we don't want to go so far and cross the line into burnout, because 1L year is a lot. It's going to demand a lot of you. And so that is why a lot of the pieces, or a very popular piece of advice that people give, is don't do anything. Don't do anything before 1L year. Take a long vacation, spend time with family and friends. And they're not wrong. That's really important because of how much 1L year is going to demand of you. But if you are also somebody who feels very empowered in knowing what's coming, in planning ahead, in taking action, and not wanting to sit on the sidelines and just let something happen to you that feels big and scary and nebulous and unknown, then the best way to get out of that looping sense in your brain, where you just kind of loop on worst case scenario and the things that are causing you fear and uncertainty and anxiety, is to take action. And so if you are in a place where you can take action, where you want to take action, those are the things that I would focus on to get the best bang for your buck in terms of time invested, but also in terms of putting yourself in the most powerful position heading into 1L year.
Love it. Love it. You have dropped so many gems. And I know that the Beat the Curve bootcamp is going to be absolutely phenomenal. Where can our listeners find out more about you, about the bootcamp? Tell us all of the places to catch up with you.
Yeah, so you can go to my website, angelavorpahl.com, first and last name.com, and that is going to have more information about the boot camp and just about 1L strategies in general. And then if you guys had any questions about anything we talked about today, any follow-up questions about the boot camp, you can also send me a DM on Instagram. It's just at Angela Vorpahl.
And trust me, she's there to help you and give you all the advice you need and even break things down like you're an eighth grader. Thank you so much, Angela, for being my guest again today. And I can't wait to have you back. Thank you.